All right, thank you very much. Well, thanks to Ned and Jan, and I'm delighted to be on a panel with Bob and Barry, although I can't greet them in person. I will talk about the Trump administration international or foreign economic policies more generally than trade, because I think that they are characteristic of a general set of issues and a general approach. The general approach is that the Trump administration favors U.S. unilateralism. This is America first in action. That's the point of departure, that rules should not bind the U.S., that if we are to negotiate, we should negotiate bilaterally, and it is a kind of divide and conquer strategy. Global negotiations are seen to be a trap. Too many unfriendly nations. Bilateral negotiations pit U.S. power against weaker counterparts. And I think that the third vision of Trump himself and the people that he's assembled around him are that we are looking for a transactional approach rather than a rule-based approach. This is the art of the deal in Trump's view, not the idea of creating a rule-based system. What is the underlying motivation for all of this? It is the decline of American power overall, which I will argue is mainly a reflection of the rise of economic and technological capacities around the world, most importantly, of course, China, but more generally, whereas Trump's assertion and the team around him assert that the U.S. has simply given up too much by being as powerful as it is and yet agreeing to play by rules which are not helpful for U.S. interests and rules which ultimately weaken U.S. power. But my view is that we have something, of course, deeper underway, which is the transition from American preeminence to America as being very powerful, no doubt, but powerful among several powerful national and regional actors. I would say that there are at least 6 components of the America First foreign economic agenda. So trade policy is only one of them. If we talk about objectives, I'll quickly say that they include increasing business investment, repatriation of industrial jobs, technological and military preeminence of the United States, U.S. primacy, a reduced trade deficit, the isolation of rogue countries or competitor countries, and the enhancement of U.S. Energy independence and energy leadership. What are the policy instruments that are being used for this? Again, going down the second column, the corporate tax cut is the centerpiece of the growth and business investment strategy. On repatriating jobs, it is tariff policy and rules of origin and other trade negotiation policies, such as the NAFTA renegotiations that aim to reestablish jobs in auto, steel, and other Midwest industries. In terms of technological and military preeminence, it is mainly to battle China through CFIUS barriers to Chinese acquisition of technology and the trade war with China, to tell China to back off its made in China 2025 policies, for example, at risk of losing the U.S. and broader markets. In terms of reducing the trade deficit, Trump's idea is that tariff and quota policies and specific sector negotiations will redress the U.S. Trade deficit. In terms of isolating other countries, it is basically to avoid or abandon U.S. treaties or UN treaties, U.S. participation in UN treaties such as JCPOA vis-a-vis Iran, and the imposition of extraterritorial sanctions to impose the U.S. point of view, for example, on Iran or North Korea or Venezuela or other rogue countries as seen from the vantage point of the U.S. administration. And on U.S. energy policy, which is viewed as economically and structurally strategic, it is to try to break up the global climate action, and first and foremost by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. The next two columns really argue that none of these policies is likely to be very effective. There are direct impacts which might have some direct benefit from the point of view of the administration. The corporate tax cuts can induce capital inflows. The tariffs on steel and aluminum or new rules of origin on automobiles within NAFTA can boost U.S. output. CFIUS barriers to China and getting our allies to impose similar restrictions on Chinese acquisitions could slow down China's gain in cutting-edge semiconductor and other ICT technologies. The idea of using trade policy to reduce trade deficits, most of us macroeconomists view as sheer nonsense. The goal is subverted even in its direct impact by a stronger dollar. Trade is reduced, but the trade deficit is hardly cut because this is a saving investment imbalance more than anything else. In terms of isolating other countries, the first round effect is indeed to cut off trade with Iran, for example, or with North Korea, and so on. And the U.S. International energy regime of pulling out of the Paris Agreement has, I think, no doubt led to a small boost of output in coal and in fracking in the United States. But if one takes into account the indirect effects of all of these policies, they seem to me to be extremely weak and poorly targeted policies. Our last big corporate tax cut in the 1980s was followed by a round of corporate tax cuts in the rest of the world, which was part of a race to the bottom, and I have no doubt that the same will transpire now for negligible net gain of U.S. business investment in the U.S., though maybe a gain of wealth of large wealth holders, and that, of course, is equally part of the goal of these corporate tax cuts. But I doubt that there'll be much business investment spurred net-net. In terms of repatriating industrial jobs, the overall effect of increased tariffs and rules of origin and the like are likely to be net negative in job effects for all the reasons that trade economists have long emphasized. On the question of America's battle against Chinese technological preeminence or eminence, let's say, I think we are entering a new technology and arms race. I don't think it's one that the United States will win per se. This is not like the last days of the Soviet Union. We face formidable counterparts, and China invests and will invest at least as much as the United States in these technologies. They have a bigger internet base of users. They have their own tech giants that they have fostered. They're not going away. In terms of trade deficit, will have no impact on that, except probably a larger trade deficit because of a larger budget deficit. In terms of the question of isolating foreign countries through our extraterritorial sanctions, my view is that as Germany, France, and the UK have recently announced, and Juncker has recently announced on behalf of the European Commission, I think we're going to have alternatives to SWIFT so that we will not really have a single overwhelming dollar-based payment system or a single overwhelming U.S.-based payments clearance mechanism, but will diminish the role of the dollar by building the role of the euro, the renminbi, and with alternative payments mechanisms. So I believe that the U.S. extraterritorial sanctions, while they have some short-term bite, are really self-inflicted wounds rather than a long-term coherent policy. And on U.S. energy independence and the Paris Climate Agreement, surely Trump is contributing to reduced global coherence of climate policy, but on the whole, the climate action will continue, not sufficiently, but it will continue because the climate change impacts are growing and are very serious, as Hurricane Florence amply demonstrates in the United States. The maintained assumptions of the Trump administration are that the U.S. has the power to achieve favorable outcomes through bilateral negotiations. Second, that there are large gains to unilateralism and bilateralism while the benefits of global rules are small. And third, and very importantly, geopolitically, the idea is the U.S. will maintain a coalition of European, Middle Eastern, and Asian countries that is U.S.-led, including, in the Trump-Bannon view, a revamped EU, India on side, Japan and Korea on side, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and others, and that they will follow the U.S. lead vis-a-vis China and rogue countries such as Iran, the DPRK, Venezuela, and other U.S. targets. I believe all of these assumptions are wrong. As I've said, I think the specific policy measures are unlikely to be successful in any of their objectives. I don't regard anything we are doing right now as structurally sound or as likely to succeed. It's creating a lot of consternation and noise, but I don't believe that these are well-designed instruments, and I don't believe in the end the U.S. is as frightening as the Trump administration thinks it is in terms of getting acquiescence. I believe, as a second point, that a rule-based global regime remains the focal point for global diplomacy. In other words, while there are the national leaders, President Xi or President Erdogan or President Putin or Prime Minister Modi, who are all strong national leaders, I don't really see the reversal of global rules as being the normative focal point. I think we have arrived, my guess, after more than 50 years of global rulemaking and more than 100 years of attempted global rulemaking, to a point where the notion of global rules as the heart of the international system is unlikely to be displaced by transactional, nationalist, balance of power tactics from a normative point of view. In other words, I believe we will continue to speak in goal-based terms and not therefore find an equilibrium in a transactional approach. A third assumption of mine, up for discussion, of course, is that I believe the U.S. will not be able to lead and maintain large and relatively stable coalitions against China, Iran, even DPRK, Syria, and so on. This is really, I think, the essence of a large part of the issue here. The U.S. believes that it will maintain U.S. leadership. So it's not unilateralism as isolation. It's not unilateralism as 1 versus 192, but it's the belief that the U.S. can maintain a balance of power coalition that's relatively stable, that the U.S. will pull Europe along in an anti-China pose, that the U.S. will ultimately prevail against Iran by aligning interests and so forth. I find this a dubious proposition because I start from the point that the world, most of the world, does not want a U.S.-led balance of power. Certainly some countries do, no doubt, but I don't think that there is a governing coalition that supports a U.S.-led quasi-hegemony. I believe that the U.S. role will continue to diminish over time, most fundamentally because of a falling share of global output, alternative payments to the U.S. dollar, continued climate action, and a rearrangement of alliances that will not be in the U.S. favor on the whole. Perhaps the most interesting question is Northeast Asia, and I believe that the U.S. approach of balancing with Japan and Korea on one side and China on the other is reaching not an immediate end game, but is slowly transforming into a Northeast Asian economic community where China, Japan, and Korea are more on side than adversarial. That would be, of course, a fundamental geopolitical change because China, Japan, and Korea together would constitute the largest integrated economic region and the largest technological region of the world. Ultimately, maybe it's my wishful thinking, but I believe that despite the prevailing nationalism and all of the structural uncertainties and damage from it, we are evolving towards a global regionalism where the EU will hold intact, the African Union will strengthen, Northeast Asia will coalesce, Southern Asia even will find a way forward, meaning that India will find common ground with Pakistan and Bangladesh. The Latin American countries will strengthen, and we will have a truly multipolar regionalism, but it will be undergirded by a continued globalism of basic rules. It will be multi-currency. It will not have any one hegemon, and if we're lucky, we won't blow ourselves up in the process. That last point of the strengthened regionalism in a global order is more my normative vision, perhaps, than a precise forecast, but that's where I think the world ought to go, not the direction that Trump is taking us. So these are just some opening thoughts, and I turn it back to you, Jan.